Welcome back to the Zero E Michigan podcast. I'm Karl Bloss, and my guest today is Ben Brown. So, Ben, if you would please introduce yourself, we'll get the conversation started. Just a quick editorial note on this conversation with Ben Brown. We covered so much ground with Ben's EV journey, as well as his excitement about the Aptera, that I decided to split this up into two podcasts. So if you're primarily interested in Aptera content, then please wait around for part two, which should be out the following week. If you're not already subscribed, I encourage you to do so that you'll be notified of part two and other upcoming content. I do think Ben's message on EV affordability and equity is worth a listen, so I hope you'll be just as interested in part one.
My name is Ben Brown. I am in Southwest Michigan. I'm a member of KEVA, Kalamazoo Electric Vehicle Association, and I've been excited and interested in electric cars since the 1970s.
That's pretty amazing. I didn't even know any were around back then. Yeah, Ben and I met through the Kalamazoo EV Association. We've been at some National Drive Electric Week events together. I had a chance to talk to Ben a little bit about his history with EVs, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. So, Ben, you have a really great story in my mind about how you got into electric vehicles, how you first found out about it, and then ultimately this led to a really great improvement in your life in terms of home ownership. Tell us a little bit about how that came to pass.
So I'm going to cover a lot of history kind of quick as I can, but in the 1970s, 80s, there was an oil crisis. And I live in a farm community where everybody makes everything. And they talked about these futuristic electric vehicles that ran off of electric. So a lot of my farmer friends tried to build them. None of us were successful, or none of them were successful. I was a little kid at the time. But it was always in my mind that one day we would advance to such a high state of technology, we'd have electric vehicles. Fast forward to the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a car produced, the EV1 through GM, and I put my name on the list for the EV1. And I was so pleased. I was so proud. I was telling friends of mine about it at an auto shop, and a couple of the people turned to me and they were really angry that I was trying to destroy the auto industry. And that kind of alerted me that it might have been a controversial idea, but I was still interested in them. I had this dream that I was in a egg, not egg shape, but an almost airplane fuselage shape thing that was floating above the ground. And my nephew had a little toy, which I absconded. I let him know I stole it eventually.
Did it
But it
did
was
it look anything like this?
without the yes, it actually did, without the wheels. And I still have it, and I normally have it on some mantle or something wherever I'm living. The EV1, I kept asking if I would be able to get one, and they said, well, we'll get back to you. Then I found out later on they had taken them all and crushed them. And about that time, I discovered the Electric Auto Association, and I started attending meetings at the Fox Valley in Illinois, and really got excited because I realized people were making electric cars at home, DIY. And at that same time, if I remember correctly, Karl, they had the Chevy had an all-electric truck and Ford had an all-electric truck. And I thought, either I'll try to buy one or I'll try to make one. Someday I will save enough money to get one. But I didn't have the technical skills to do that. And instead, I ended up buying a Honda Insight. Are you
So, which is a
familiar?
hybrid, yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
And hypermiling, I could get like 100 miles, roughly 100-mile equivalent. And I thought, well, I'm getting closer to that. And I forgot to mention all of this. I was also really concerned about the global situation in terms of oil being dependent on oil, so many wars caused by oil,
Hmm.
a nation's feeling it was their their right to protect oil in someone else's country. And I thought, this is not wonderful. And I said, I have to someday maybe get an electric car, but I'm earning minimum wage, college degree and all. Um, it didn't help me make more than minimum wage in any of my jobs, even when I was training for nursing. And so I ended up, after I think maybe 8 years, 9 years with my Insight, it was dying. The battery management system was dying, and it was going to cost me maybe $10,000 to fix
Mm.
all of the computers, get all of that. And I just couldn't do it. So I ended up riding a bike. But I was telling friends of mine about electric cars, and that was going to be something really great. And Dr. Paul Pansella, you might know him.
Of course.
Uh,
Hmm.
he mentioned he had a friend that his wife had purchased a Nissan Leaf. And right after she purchased it, she had been teaching in maybe 45 minutes away. She got reassigned to teach in South Africa. And so they already had three vehicles. And he had told his wife they couldn't justify the payments for this thing. And so Paul knew Dr. David Schuster, whose wife had the car, and they connected us. And Dr. Schuster suggested uh, to help his wife keep her car that perhaps we could share um, the expenses. And for the days of the week that I worked, which I was a nurse aide at that time, that we could car share. And that that could you imagine how I've always wanted to have an electric car and I get to car share this thing?
And so
And
that
it's
worked
like,
out. So that worked out, right? So you were able to do that and learn how it actually is to drive an electric car. Is that right?
absolutely. It was, how would you describe the experience of driving or riding in an electric car? Just was
So,
your first impressions. Do you
yeah,
remember?
I absolutely do. It was a seminal moment in my life, I have to say. I was in Germany at the time. I was on an expat assignment and I was working for a chemical company, and I my job was inside one of the chemical parks, so it's a closed environment in terms of driving. And one of the people who did our vessel inspections, he had a loaner of a Mini Cooper electric, and it was a test mule that BMW was letting, selected people drive in restricted environments, not on a public street, just to get people's impressions. And I think they were tuning the battery management system and the drive system. He came to us, a couple plant managers, and said, "You got to drive this thing. This is unbelievable. I've never had anything like this in my life." And he let us get behind the wheel. And the thing that I remember most is the regen. Of course, the
Really?
torque, the torque,
Oh,
you step on it, but it was you were inside a chem park, so there was like a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. So it's not like we could do a high speed launch
right.
legally, and we didn't, obviously safety. But I remember the regen, and it was really aggressive regen. So it was like you take your foot off the accelerator, and the car almost immediately came to a stop, and then pretty quickly you're learning one pedal driving, and then it was somebody else's turn, so I had to relinquish. But I was like, wow, mind blown, right? And then when I came back to the US, I ended up buying an off-lease Nissan Leaf. But absolutely, I remember that feeling and the acceleration and the lack of noise. And yeah, it was absolutely mind-blowing.
That you had never had an experience like that ever before with the car, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I had some fast cars. I mean, I owned a Porsche at one point, a turbo. I had a Mitsubishi Eclipse with a 2-liter turbo. I mean, it was a quick car, all-wheel drive, a lot of fun to drive, but I'd never experienced anything like this. This was, and we're not even talking about necessarily performance, but just the feeling of, the linear acceleration. You're not going through gears where you go through a torque curve. Um, and yeah, it was like, okay, I got to look into this now, right? It was absolutely life-changing for me.
Yes, and same thing with the Leaf. My experience driving the Leaf, in fact, after driving that, I and realizing that its emissions were so much lower, I said, even if I'm having to work at McDonald's, which I was didn't have to, I was working as a nurse aide, but I said I have to save my money to get an electric car somehow.
So at some point you had to give that car back, I assume, because I assume that person came back at some point. And so what was the kind of the next step?
Wow. Well, actually, before I had to give it back, I discovered I could go online and look like through Auto Trader, all those different types of sites that have used vehicles, and specify electric vehicles and specify the price. And so I started doing that. And um, I also played the harp. And so I was looking for a vehicle that would be large enough that I could put the harp in. And I discovered the Mitsubishi i-MiEV. And I I had a budget of roughly $10,000. I went to my credit union, first of all,
Mhm.
and I said, this is what I want to do. Can you help me figure out how to do that? And my credit union has been absolutely fantastic in helping me up until now um, figure out how to make things happen financially.
Mhm.
And they said, this is kind of going out on a limb, but we think we can help you come up with the $10,000 based on what you've already saved. And so I went online and I found an i-MiEV. Actually, I found two i-MiEVs that were close. And one was maybe $12,000. The other was 10. Um, the $12,000 one, it offered this head up basically computer screen.
Mhm.
And I knew from driving the Leaf that that computer screen would tell you where all the charging stations were, right?
Mhm.
What do you think that computer screen said on the i-MiEV?
No stations anywhere in range, right?
No, it showed only where gas stations were. But, but the dealer did not know that. I did not know that. So for $2,000 more, I purchased that vehicle thinking that I'd have access to all of that information along with navigation. So I purchased. The credit union really went out on a limb. They also talked to the dealer, and I got it for $12,000. And I think they either lowered the price so the taxes included that,
Mhm.
but um, that was that was it. And it came from the Carolinas on a truck for $50 was the shipping fee, which I think was pretty
Yeah, that's
exceptional.
pretty good.
Yes,
That's
yes, it
exciting.
was. Yeah,
And this is still a car that you have today, right? That's still the same
yes,
i-MiEV that you
right.
have today?
It's
So,
almost 12 years old, 12, 13 years old now, and still I have not, like today when I charged it, it was still getting 63, 64 miles fully charged, and it's rated for 60. But I've driven it as far as 90 miles on a charge before I've had to charge it.
what's your odometer, or how many miles have you put on it?
I'm going to say on average, I don't go much more than like maybe 6,000, 6 to 9,000 miles a year
Hmm.
on it.
Okay.
So,
But that's still considerable. And I think that also busts one of those myths that, these days everybody wants to have an EV that's 200, 300 miles of range, which, I understand. I upgraded my 2016 Leaf with less than 100 miles range to a Kia Niro because of my use case. But to be honest, when I first had my Leaf, it was my commuter car and I was commuting 20 miles round trip plus maybe some little side trips, stop at the grocery store, pick up the kids. And it was perfectly adequate for that. Not only that, but I had workplace charging, so I was essentially driving for free. So I didn't even have to charge at home because I had that free charging perk. And nonetheless, I would have gladly charged at home. I bought the charger and put in the high power outlet to allow me to charge, just like you have at your house. I've been to your house and which then speaking of which, if you're willing to talk about this, so one of the things that having an electric car allowed you to do with lower maintenance expenses, lower operating costs, is to take the leap into homeownership. Is that something that you would be willing to
Oh,
share?
oh my gosh, yes. Because I have I have friends that are far wealthier than I am who are terrified of buying an electric car because they feel that it's something that's going to be a money pit they won't be able to afford. There'll be all the you have to replace the batteries. I found that I saved so much money um, in car ownership, and I always try to save even on minimum wage when I was doing minimum wage. Um, Tried to save money, squirrel some away. It helped me enough that I qualified through a program, through a couple of programs in our region for home ownership. And I didn't have the maintenance costs, I didn't have to get a loan to get the insight fixed because all my other used vehicles, I continually had to keep putting money into repairs.
Mhm.
And in 12 years, I've had to replace the brakes once. And then last year we had the the battery management
Mhm.
challenge, but that that was still a fraction of the cost that I've spent. So it has saved me just an unbelievable amount of money
Mhm.
to own an electric vehicle, and also important to purchase an electric vehicle if you are willing to look around and look used, and definitely do your homework for sure.
Mhm.
Um, it's it's able to, you're able to at least find a car that should meet most people's needs, not everybody's necessarily,
Sure.
but sure met my needs. And to be honest, it's not necessarily practical, my car, to go across country, but I know people that have. I've gone from Kalamazoo up above Mount Pleasant. I've gone to Ann Arbor on multiple trips, and that was using level two charging.
Mhm.
And that required stops, but I did a lot of office work and paperwork when I was stopped. If there's a coffee shop, I could do that.
Mhm.
But I would be curious if you have some thoughts about that, further thoughts, Karl.
Well, one thing that I think people forget about is that renting a vehicle for the right use case is always an option. So in other words, let's say for 95% of your driving, you're driving locally or regionally where a short range or an intermediate range EV will work for you, but then you're saving so much money on fuel and maintenance, like you said, every once in a while you need a different vehicle. Sometimes you got to rent a moving truck. I've rented a, 7, 8 passenger minivan when I needed to do that for a road trip, and I don't feel any qualms about doing that. Yes, I'm burning gas, but in the meantime, I don't have a minivan sitting in my garage that's not being used 90% of the time, which is really the situation that we found ourselves in after we got the Leaf. We had the Leaf, and then we had a Toyota Sienna minivan. And so that was our road trip vehicle. So obviously we were not taking the Leaf on road trips. Again, like you said, some people are adventurous. They've done it. I mean, I drove my Leaf across country to get it from Missouri to Michigan when I moved up here as an adventure. Back, 2018 when it was much more difficult with the charging infrastructure. You can do it, but obviously it's tedious. And, a lot of people only have so much vacation. For me, the solution was go rent a minivan. And now I have room for everybody that wants to ride in there in comfort. So, I don't think that you necessarily need to buy the one vehicle that does everything for you. And I think that's a little bit, if I can extrapolate, maybe the folks that tend to look at pickup trucks where it's the one vehicle that does everything, right? It's the thing that gets you the groceries, it gets you to work, but it'll also haul your boat or your other trailer, your camping trailer. And that's fine if that's what you want to do. But if it's one of those use cases where it's something that you do maybe, once a year, maybe it might be better just to go out and rent one of those. I mean, I, I'm grateful that I have a Chrysler dealer near me that will rent me a Dodge Caravan or a similar Pacifica minivan that has all the bells and whistles, all the comforts, and I don't have to worry about maintaining it. I pay my rental fee, I turn it back in, and I'm super happy about that. So I mean that's kind of my take on short range vehicles and also used EVs. Maybe one more point, since you've bought yours, there is now through the Inflation Reduction Act a $4,000 tax credit available for buying a used EV. And now there are some stipulations. You need to buy it through a licensed dealer. It has to be no more than $25,000 purchase price. It can't have been already uh, sold in such a way that somebody claimed that credit. In other words, kind of an anti-flipping stipulation that people don't buy and sell these things just to keep milking $4,000. But it is something that's out there, which again kind of reduces the threshold of getting your foot in the door for a lot of people that, for them that the difference between being able to afford it and not afford it.
And also too, if you're a two-car household already, or even a at least two-car household,
Hmm.
um, to trade one of those out as an electric vehicle for local driving, to me, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's like putting money in the bank.
Yeah.
I just think it's
And
really
that's
handy.
that's exactly how I got started with the Leaf. And what we found is that car was saving us so much money that more often than not, we would take the Leaf rather than the minivan. Even when the minivan sometimes would have been a little bit more comfortable, we would now go a little bit out of our comfort zone and try to find charging stations just to be able to use the Leaf. Because even with that, with paying for public charging, which is a little bit more than home charging, it was still less expensive, and I still had to do fewer oil changes on the combustion car. So yeah, I think that's a great use case where maybe your second or whatever you're just your commuter vehicle. Once the one that you currently have is no longer doing the job, think about an electric and think about a used one where you don't have a huge investment. I also know that some people are looking at leasing more than buying because they think, well, this way I'm not worried about battery degradation, which by the way is not as big of a deal as people tend to make it out to be, right? I'm guessing you haven't replaced your battery. I sold a Tesla Model S with 125,000 miles that still had over 90% of its original capacity. It's just not something that most of us worry about, even though there's this myth out there that that's something that has to be done periodically, and it's really not the case.
I absolutely think that there's such a strong case for especially a local commuter car. If your commute is under 40 miles round trip, or even under 40 miles or 50 miles.
Hmm.
I remember when I was going to the Fox Valley Electric Vehicle Association meeting, they were celebrating having a truck that they had built, one of the members had built, that had a 25-mile range. And he would drive to work, charge, and then drive home. And that was considered a commuter car. Today, I have friends that are convinced if the car can't do 120 miles round trip in Kalamazoo, it's not a commuter car. Um, I think one of the challenges is that people don't necessarily estimate what they really drive or don't realize that they could charge. Like my workplace, when I worked hospice, they were really good about allowing me to plug in there, you know. And
Hmm.
even the library where I work currently, if it's a need case, is the general policy currently, I can plug in at the library and it's more than sufficient. And so the food co-op that I belong to, we decided as a group that we would put in a charger.
Hmm.
So we have a charger there that's free for anyone to use.
Yeah, I
Um,
contributed to that project, by the way.
Yay, you are
They
a hero.
yeah, the co-op had an online shopping cart, and one of the things was a fundraiser for this charging station, and I thought that was such a cool project that I participated in that. So yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Thank you very much. There have been several Teslas that have charged there, and I've talked to two different households, two different families, and they were saying that their budget was extremely low, and they were able to purchase these two Teslas at least because of the Inflation Reduction Act
Hmm.
for for the low $20,000.
Wow.
And so it opened up doors. So again, the idea of realizing used vehicles, there's a big range. Again, I would caution someone to do their homework. I had looking at the future now, and I am thinking that, wonderful as my car, Greg, I call it Greg because it's gray and egg shaped. But as wonderful as Greg is, there will be some things that I would like to do in the future in terms of longer range. Currently, I like taking Amtrak,
Hmm.
and so if I'm going on long distance, but there is this really fantastic car coming out that will operate. You can charge up to 40 miles just with solar in a day. Are you familiar with this car by any chance?
If you're primarily interested in Aptera content, then please wait around for part two. If you enjoyed or learned from this episode of Zero E Michigan, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. Visit our YouTube channel for other related videos at youtube.com/at the number 0 E-Michigan.